Welcome, everyone. So glad you could all come to the presentation today, the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the Role of Science, Politics, and People. I'm Dina Herman, and I'm faculty here in the Fielding School of Public Health, and also director of the MCH Nutrition Leadership Training Program. And this event is actually being supported by our funders, HRSA and MCHB, as well as our training program and our colleagues at UC Berkeley School of Public Health. So thank you very much for your support. I want to make sure and recognize there's a number of different groups of people that we've invited here from UCLA, and perhaps most importantly, our state nutritionists from the 13 regions in the West. So I'd like those of you who are here as state nutritionist representatives to please stand up so we can recognize you, and we want to make sure everyone gets included in the conversation. So if you're here from one of the 13 states, representing 13 states, stand up. Excellent. So these are people you'll want to talk to. Also, I'm not sure if you're all aware, but it is Public Health Week. And so I'd like to recognize all the folks here from the Fielding School of Public Health who come to join us for the conversation today. Could you guys stand up? Charlotte, Newmans. Okay, Janet Leader, thank you very much. Excellent. And then finally, everyone else, stand up please, from UCLA, the greater LA area, and everyone else who's traveled to come take part in our presentation today. So please stand up. We want to, so everyone knows who you are. Thank you. Okay, all of our trainees and other folks. I know you all know this, but I did want to point out that the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is one of the strongest public health tools that we actually have available to us to recognize the nutrition and health benefits of the diverse communities that we serve and the myriad of environments that they live in, whether it's here locally, in the state of California, or in the nation. As such, I'd like to invite you all to use this amazing opportunity that we have here tonight to engage with all the different groups that are represented here in the room and start that conversation about how we can put this opportunity that we have today to work to improve the health of our local communities and, of course, the nation as a whole. So now I have the pleasure of introducing you to our speakers. First, Laureen Ritchie, who's the director of the Nutrition Policy Institute and has devoted her 20-year career to synthesizing and conducting research to inform nutrition policy and programs. The goal of her work is the prevention of food insecurity, obesity, and chronic disease, as well as the promotion of health and wellness, with an emphasis on the youngest and most vulnerable populations and the federal nutrition assistance programs. She works on a number of projects. I'm going to just share a couple of them with you, and we'll hear more about them today. Some of her current research projects include evaluation of interventions to improve water intake in lieu of sugary drinks for children, the relationship of school-level programs on student dietary intakes and weight status, and the impact of WIC nutrition education in child feeding practices and how the feeding of young children in 0 to 5 years have evolved over time. So that's Laureen. We'll hear from her first. And then following will be Angie Tagtow, who many of you may know was appointed in 2014 by President Barack Obama as the Executive Director of the USDA Center for Nutrition Policy and Programs. CMPP strives to improve the health and well-being of Americans by developing, promoting national dietary guidance that links scientific research to the nutrition needs of consumers. During that time, Angie co-led the development and the launch of the 2015-2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She also oversaw the development and release of the dynamic My Plate, My Wins Consumer Nutrition Education Campaign. So with much pleasure, I turn the podium over to Laureen Ritchie and Angie, and listen to the presentations tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Welcome to my talk, which is going to preview what Angie's going to talk about. And I just want to say I'm so indebted to you, Dina, for inviting me, and Barbara for inviting me as well. And I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the fact that I'm the warm-up act for Angie, because I've never been spoken before someone who's as famous and influential in our field as Angie is. So it's really a pleasure to start us off tonight. Be louder? Yes. Ah, that's the problem when you're so tall. Pull it up. It doesn't pull. Ah, very good. Okay, so I can either bend down or I can stand up. I'd rather stand up. All right, so without further ado, let me get started. And the slides won't go. All right. So I'm from the University of California, your sister campus. We are in Berkeley, but we also represent part of the land-grant university system, part of cooperative extension. So I'm here representing ag and natural resources. And I am going to talk about feeding infants and toddlers, recommendations for the dietary guidelines debut. And for those of you who have been following the dietary guidelines, you know that the dietary guidelines have been around for quite some time. They started in 1980 and have gone and been updated every 5 years since. The last one was in 2015, and we're getting now for the 2020 to 2025 version of the dietary guidelines. These dietary guidelines have a very lot of things in common, and one of them is that they've never included 0 to 2-year-olds. They've never included pregnant women, and they've never included the elderly folks over 65, although the older I get, 65 sounds really young now. That's all about to change. And so what I'm going to share with you today, before Angie talks with you about the process that the dietary guidelines undergo and what the future is going to hold for them, I wanted to share with you some of the work we're doing to inform the inclusion of that very important group to all of you, the 0 to 24-month-olds. All right, so first I'm going to share some work that we've been doing in the WIC environment with participants to show improvements over the past 20 years, why we need to continue to focus, and why I'm so excited that the dietary guidelines are going to include this critical age group of birth to 24 months. Some needs, some reasons that you all are here, some reasons that we all have this training program, and then some promising directions for the future. I'm okay. I'll be fine. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to share with you a USDA-funded study. How many people have ever heard of the WIC Infant Toddler Feeding Practices Study? Oh, good. Great. So you might remember that there was an iteration of this study 20 years ago, and it's called the WIC Infant Feeding Practices Study because children were followed from WIC at birth up until about 1 year of age. This is the first repeat of that study, but it's unique in several different ways. And I'm privileged to work with WestCat and PHFE WIC, my co-PI Shannon Whaley, and us at MPI to work on this study. And the unique part about it is we have recruited approximately 3,000 women during pregnancy or shortly after birth, and we are following those babies for 6 years. The babies right now are about, I shouldn't call them babies anymore, they're turning 4-ish. The study will end in 2020 when they turn approximately 6 years old. And so over the next couple of years, please look forward to reports that will be coming out sharing the findings of the infant feeding practices through toddler years and then through later development. The other really interesting thing and innovative thing about this study compared to the earlier one is we have weight and height outcomes. So we have them going back to their WIC clinics or to their medical providers and getting measured every so often during the course of the study. I would love to be able to share with you all of the study results, but I have to tell you that the process for releasing the reports is one that requires a lot of vetting with a lot of different people, peer reviewers as well as USDA reviewers. And at the end, I'll share with you what data is available now. But hopefully, we'll have, before the Dietary Guideline Committee meets, we'll have even more information for them to use. So this particular study is taking place in 80 WIC sites in the nation. And I can't tell you what those sites are, but if you look at the little red dots, you will see that we're distributed all over the country, 27 different states. Not all of the WIC participants stay on WIC, but we continue to follow them up, and at the moment we have about an 85% retention rate. So we're doing really well keeping even the folks that go off of WIC in the study. What I'm going to do next is show you some of the things that you all have achieved in your work in maternal child health, specifically with the WIC population now compared to 20 years ago. And I think you'll be very impressed with yourselves because we've made a lot of strides. So this particular slide shows some prenatal perspectives, what women thought about breastfeeding before they actually got to the point of being able to breastfeed. And the red bars are the 20-year-ago data, and the gray bars are now. And what you can see is that for almost every single question we asked about their perceptions of breastfeeding, we have seen improvements. So for example, oh, you know what? I know why this is going backwards. I'm holding it upside down. With bottle feeding, the mother knows that the baby is getting enough to eat. You can see that that hasn't changed too much. But if you go down the list, breastfeeding ties you down. Look at that huge difference. In almost half of women 20 years ago thought, ooh, breastfeeding really puts a hamper in my lifestyle, and now that's endorsed by relatively few women. Breastfeeding in public is not something that I want to do. That's another one that it decreased a lot. People feel much more able to do that kind of behavior. And this is the real excitement. So 20 years ago, about half of women initiated breastfeeding at the birth of their child. That has increased almost by 50%. So now 8 out of 10 WIC women is initiating breastfeeding at the birth of their child, which is an incredible change over just a short amount of 20-year period. The other thing to celebrate is that those increases in breastfeeding initiation have occurred across all race and ethnicity groups. So Hispanics were always the ones that had the largest initiation. Even they have increased. And look at the difference for African American and Black, over double the number of women compared to 20 years ago initiating breastfeeding. But we still do have some work to do. So the initiation rates are much higher than they were 20 years ago, and you see the drop-off breastfeeding. This is any breastfeeding, by the way. It's about 61% of women are doing any breastfeeding compared to half that amount at 1 month of age. And still, even at 7 months, the numbers are about twice as many women are doing any breastfeeding now compared to 20 years ago. But this is what the 2020 goal is. That is that about 2/3 of women are doing any breastfeeding at 6 months. So we still have a ways to go in order to reach that mark. Less formula use in the first year of life. This corresponds to what I showed you about breastfeeding. If breastfeeding goes up, less formula feeding. And you can see across the board at all the age groups from 1 month to 7 months, we see less formula use now compared to 20 years ago. And then finally, introduction of complementary foods. So you know now the current guidelines are that at approximately 6 months of age, 5 or 6 months, children be introduced to solid foods. And so for reference, I put up the 180 days is equivalent to 6 months, and you can see that we're pretty similar for most things like high protein foods and dairy foods and salty snacks, but for sweet foods, look at the difference. A huge increase in the amount of the age at which women or mothers and fathers are introducing sweet foods to their infants. And that's also true for fruit juice and sweetened beverages. So those are all good things that we can celebrate, that we're training on, teaching our mothers and fathers to introduce those foods later and later to infants. And this graph also shows the time series between 2003 and 2011 in beverages. So you can see milk intake is pretty solid, stayed pretty stable between the early 2000s and now. And sugary drinks have gone down, and 100% juice has gone down. So that's encouraging news as well. So why am I saying we still have some work to do? So I alluded to that with some of the breastfeeding numbers. But you all know these statistics that in the 1970s, we saw that about 5% of kids had BMI over the 5th percentile, which is exactly where it should be, because we know that there's going to be a distribution, right? And 5% of kids normally nourished and normally growing and functioning just fine should be overweight. That's how the definition works. And that's what the situation was in the 60s and 70s. But you all know that that changed very, very rapidly. And most recently, we had seen a slight and encouraging dip between 2009 and 2011 that made us think, we maybe are turning the corner. Skinner in January, I think, came out with an article in Pediatrics that found that the 2 to 5-year-old number had gone back up a little bit. I'm not too worried about this because, as you know from NHANES, the number of kids in the NHANES sample is fairly small. And the Skinner article only accumulated data from 2 years, and we tend to want to, in order to get adequate sample sizes, accumulate data for more like 4 years in NHANES before we say, okay, this is a trend. So this could just be a little blip, but regardless of whether it is a blip or not, the overall data is showing that we're plateauing, and we need to do more because we need to go the opposite direction now in decreasing the prevalence. So we still have a lot of work to do. The other important reason, besides obesity prevention, that nutrition, and I'm speaking to the choir here, is so important with these youngsters, is this slide shows the percentage of calories that come from different food groups by age. And if you focus just on one example, and in the green is fruits and vegetables, I think what you can easily see is that by the time a child is not even a year old, those patterns are pretty set. In other words, the very, very basic foundation of the 0 to 24-month, even 0 to 12-month-old, largely establishes the habits that are going to be continued for the rest of that child's life. Now, it's not that we can't change them, but if we institute healthy habits early, then we have a lot less work to do. We don't have to change, we can just keep it going. That's the other reason for this focus, and the reason we're so excited that the dietary guidelines are going to include the 0 to 24-month-olds. Some needs, and Angie's going to talk a little bit about this too, but I wanted to focus on these little guys. So if you just look at the 1 to 3-year-olds here, this graph shows what the recommended intakes are for age in blue, for boys and for girls, compared to what the national averages are in orange. You see how, and this you'll see over and over in these slides, the little guys are doing better than the older guys. If we can keep those healthy habits maintained after the children turn 4, 9, 14, etc., then we can make a lot of strides for their overall health. Vegetables, I mean, the little guys here are not quite where they need to be for vegetables as they were for fruit, but you see how much they're closer than the older kids are and the adults. Same with whole grains and grains. Well, not so much for whole grains, but for grains, you see that the intake for the youngest children is closer to the recommended intake We have a lot of work to do for all of our population in terms of making this number half this number. So that's a target. Added sugars, and you all know this story. Added sugars, again, we're close for the littlest in our populations, but we have a lot of work to do to keep that level of sugar intake steady and avoid these blips that happen later in life. Some promising directions. I wanted to share with you some other work that we've been doing, and this is hopefully, how many people have seen these new guidelines on what and how to feed? Okay, good. So a lot of you have, some of you haven't. So in anticipation of the dietary guidelines for the first time, including 0 to 24-month-olds, Robert Wood Johnson, under the leadership of Mary Story and the Healthy Eating Research Program of Robert Wood Johnson, convened Rafael Perez Esquilla, who you probably all know. He's one of our leading breastfeeding advocates and researchers, and Sofia Segura Perez, to lead a panel of members, some of whom I think might even be in this room, besides myself, to review the literature and come up with recommendations that we could then share with the Dietary Guidelines Committee in advance of the Dietary Guidelines. So what I would like to share with you now are some of the components of the framework that we used when we created these guidelines. It's called the Responsive Parenting Framework. You're probably all familiar with it, but I'll walk you through it a little bit. I'll describe responsive feeding, and then I'll explain the guidelines and their intended uses. Now, the guidelines are not brief, not quite as lengthy as the dietary guidelines, but it's a fairly large report, so I'm not going to go through every single one with you, but I'll show you the highlights of it, and then you can go and look at it yourself, hopefully, afterwards. So, of course, we wanted to inform parents and caregivers and health professionals, but we also have developed some one-pagers for some of the food assistance programs, so for CACFP and WIC, so that we could inform the early childhood setting as well as the WIC program. And then, of course, obviously, like I keep saying, we really want these guidelines to be useful to the Dietary Guidelines Committee so that their work hopefully is made a little bit easier. So this is the process that we undertook, and it's not terribly dissimilar from what the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee does, except that we didn't use the systematic review process, which Andy will talk about a little bit later. But we did review key studies on topics identified as crucial for this age group, including how children learn to eat, since this is such an important developmental stage where children are converting from a completely liquid diet to a solid and liquid diet. We wanted to talk about not just what they should eat, but also how. Review of responsive feeding randomized control trials. I'll share that with you a little bit. We also wanted to be inclusive of the diverse guidelines that are out there. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. There are a lot of professional organizations that have put out information and guidelines, but not in one whole place. So we wanted to try to put those all together. Rafael also did interviews with experts beyond the panel members to help inform these guidelines. And then we developed messages on what and how to feed the infants and toddlers using a very interesting process where we had to come to consensus. So for the course of a year, we met on the phone every month or every other month, and until we all came to a consensus that this was how we wanted to proceed, we'd keep hashing through it. And it was a very interesting process. We developed guidelines for age groups, 0 to 6 months, 6 to 12, 12 to 24. I already mentioned we used responsive parenting and feeding as the approach, and I'll talk a little bit about why. I'm not going to have time to go through all of these topics, but we tried to be as inclusive of all the things that contribute to feeding as we could. Responsive parenting, you may ask, well, what is that and why did we pick it? It is a parenting style that many studies have now shown are related to improved dietary intake of children and less obesity. And the reason that it is hypothesized to do that is because it promotes child self-regulation. The reason we tied this together with all of parenting is because if you're a parent, you know that you're not just teaching your child how to eat, you're not just helping them to learn how to go to sleep and wake up and follow the family rules and dress themselves and use the toilet and all the many, many, many things you have to teach them. You're teaching them how to respond to their internal cues, how to recognize external cues, and how to regulate themselves, so that a baby that cries and wants to eat at any time of day turns into a 1-year-old who can eat 3 meals a day and 2 snacks a day or 3 snacks a day and sit with the family and learns that, oh, meals come at this certain time. I know when to expect them. I can be hungry for a little while without crying because I know that mom and dad are going to feed me. So those kinds of self-regulation abilities are things that have to be learned and taught. And they involve a lot of the things that if you're a new parent relate to feeding, certainly, but also all the other things that you're dealing with as a parent. So responsive parenting applies to feeding, soothing, sleep, and also physical activity and screen time. And so that's why we included all of those topics within this responsive parenting framework and in this guidelines, because all of those factors can relate to what and how much the child eats, their caloric intake and their caloric expenditure, and ultimately their weight. So, responsive parenting, or responsive feeding rather, involves a reciprocity between the child and the adult. How many of you have read some parenting books or child feeding books and realized that most of the guidance was for what the parent is supposed to do and not how you're supposed to respond to the child? And I'm probably going to see hands raised from people like my generation, because in the old days, it was the parent who was supposed to be in charge of everything, and the child was supposed to follow. There was very little recognition of the fact that children come in all different colors, sizes, temperaments, and configurations. I had to have 3 children to learn that, and if I had stopped with 2, I would have been a very arrogant nutritionist, because the first 2 followed the rules. They read the books that I read, apparently, and they did exactly what they were supposed to do. And then the 3rd one came along and decided that he was very temperamental about food and was what we call a picky eater. We didn't use that term in front of him. And he really challenged all of those things that the first 2 children just took and did without any guidance, seemingly, from me. So I wanted to focus on responsive feeding in the sense that not all children respond exactly the same way, and not all parents have exactly the same parenting style. So how can we teach parents that come from the perspective of maybe having more controlling versus being more liberal or more responsive, being more laissez-faire? How can we teach all of those parents to respond to their infants appropriately, and how can we teach them that their infant and their child is going to give them signals that they need to respond to in order to work out the relationship? So that was the guidance. I'm going to walk us through some of the recommendations that came from this report using that responsive parenting framework. You all know that the AAP recommends infants be breastfed exclusively for about the first 6 months, and then introduced to complementary foods, and continuing for at least 1 year. And that the introduction of solids doesn't happen before 4 months of age, and we took that directly from the American Academy of Pediatrics. But what we did was add a whole bunch of ancillary information about when to know your child is ready for complementary foods. So the guideline of about 6 months is, that can be very traumatizing to parents, because it's not rigid. You're supposed to be responsive and responding to the cues of the child. It's much easier to say just at 6 months, that birthday, do it. it's much harder to teach parents to respond to their child's cues. So we spend a lot of time in the report talking about what those milestones are. And some of them you know very well, but sitting in without support, having good head and neck control, being able to lose that reflex of just spitting food out, but actually being able to hold food in their mouth. The extrusion reflex goes away around 5 or 6 months. Bringing things to their mouth. And then my favorite, which always was the one that I used for my kids, is if you sat them at the table before they were eating, and every time you brought the spoon to your mouth, they went. That was a very clear signal that they were understanding what feeding was about and wanting to experience it. We also then follow up with guidelines for 6 to 12 months. Breast milk or formula, of course, continue to be the most important sources of nourishment. We talk a lot about how much and what to offer during those next 6 months, a variety of fruits and vegetables. We recommend no 100% fruit juice until at least 1 year of age. First, solid foods to be rich in iron and zinc. That can be fortified cereals or meats, and gradually transition so that by the time a child turns 12 months old, and this of course will vary with the child, but by the time they turn 12 months old, they are eating with the family, table food that the rest of the family eats. Like I said, we spend a lot of time working on, in the report, working on hunger and satiety signals so that parents could have really good guidance about when children are ready for all these transitions. I know as a parent, you want, again, to have very clear guidance, and it would be much easier if every child was ready at exactly the same time, but that just is not the case. So we spent a lot of time focusing on hunger signals and satiety signals so parents could recognize not only when the child was hungry, but when a child was full. In the 12 to 24 month period, we focused on a variety of fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, and whole grains. Developmentally appropriate portion sizes. Now, I know in my work with families, this is one of the hardest things to teach, and it doesn't matter if you're working with a parent of a 1-year-old or the parent of a 20-year-old. Portion sizes are really hard to estimate, and people tend to give much or expect children to eat much more than they actually need. So we spent a lot of time talking in the report about what appropriate portion sizes are. And for an infant, it could be 1 or 2 tablespoons, which is very small. A parent thinks that they're starving their child if you only give 1 to 2 tablespoons, but that is the appropriate serving size for a young infant. Foods to avoid or limit, we also spent a lot of time on that, trying to help parents to reduce those things that the national and Haines studies show are being overconsumed: sugary beverages, fruit juice, added sugars, high sodium, and trans fats. I don't know how many of you work with pregnant women? Not too many. So this is something that's taught a lot in WIC, but probably not almost anywhere else that I've worked. And that is the fact that the maternal diet during pregnancy can obviously nourish the mom and the baby, but also can teach the child about flavors, because some of the flavors pass in utero to the baby. And studies have shown, for example, that a mother that eats a lot of vegetables and a variety of fruits, that child will be born more likely to eat fruits and vegetables when they're introduced solid foods, either through pregnancy and also through the breast milk. So that's one important thing to pass on to your families. Children also learn by habit. So if they never get, as an infant, seated at the table with their older children, the older siblings and the older members of the family, then they won't learn how to eat and have proper table manners. So that's important. If parents eat other foods that they don't want their kids to eat, that sends probably one of the strongest messages that, oh, those foods are okay, and I'm going to want those even though I'm not allowed to eat them. Those are the things I want to eat. So caregivers' eating behaviors are important. And then repeated exposure, and you probably all know this, that it can take as many as 20 times for a child to develop a taste or likeness for a new food. And like I said, my first two followed that exactly. They usually took 2 to 5 times before they liked a food, and then my third was more like 100 times. So, there's a variation and a range in that number, but it's very common for children to need to be exposed to a new food multiple times before they will accept it. I did want to share with you a few of the findings from the responsive parenting and feeding trials from which we took the framework that I've been sharing with you. Interestingly, since the last, I would say 5 or 10 years, there have been a number of very rigorously done trials that have taught parents responsive feeding and then followed those children for multiple years to see what are the nutritional and weight outcomes. And almost all of those studies have found significant impacts on weight and significant impacts on nutrition and significant impacts, interestingly, on other elements of that responsive feeding framework that I shared with you, such as sleep patterns, where I don't know how many of you have ever counseled a woman who's struggling with a child that's really having difficulty staying asleep and sleeping very many hours at a time. And one of the things that they quickly will reach for is the bottle, formula, or food. So can I put cereal in that bottle to get the child to sleep longer? Can I give the baby more concentrated formula to get the child to sleep longer? Can I introduce solids earlier to get them to sleep longer? Because sleep deprivation for our parents can make you crazy. So the key in these trials was that they talked about the whole of parenting, all of the responsive parenting, not just food, but sleep and play and all the activities that a child were learning. So it was a cohesive whole rather than just trying to pick apart different behaviors. And then the trials also included a big element about soothing. So babies cry and infants fuss and toddlers scream for a lot of different reasons, and sometimes it's they're hungry and sometimes it's a million other reasons. And as you learn about your child, you get to be able to distinguish what a hungry cry or a need for food looks like compared to my diapers needs changing, or I'm uncomfortable, or I'm tired, or I'm too warm, or any of the other number of things that might bother a child. So that was one of the things that the trials really did a good job at, is teaching parents to respond to the infant cries, learning what those different cries meant, and then being able to respond appropriately and not always assuming that food was the thing that they needed in order to make the child stop crying. And then finally, because I'm at the Nutrition Policy Institute and we talk all about policy systems, environmental change, of course we had to include in our report that we want to influence not just parents, but the entire system in which parents work and operate. So ranging from the healthcare field to home visiting programs, early care and education, work sites, and of course WIC, and some of the programs you all run, so that these messages hopefully will be integrated across all the things and places that parents go to for information. Because one of the most confusing things for a parent is if one person says one thing and another person says the other thing. And if you have had the experience in WIC like I have of being told, well, that's not what my doctor said, why are you telling me to do this? So the best advice is when we all be on the same page and use these responsive feeding guidelines to reinforce each other instead of conflict with each other. So I was going to bring a few copies of the report, and I couldn't quite do that, so I wanted to give you the website for it. Also on that website is, like I said, the briefs for early care and education as well as for WIC. There's also webinars and slides there where various members of our panel have done presentations that go into quite even more depth than I was able to today, and an executive summary as well. And I'll just leave you with this quote before I turn it over to Angie, that no epidemic has ever been resolved by paying attention to the treatment of the affected individual. And that's my plug to you, that I really admire and value your work. I admire and value your passion, and I hope that we can continue to work together to see those 20-year gains that we did in the WIC infant toddler feeding practices. This next generation of students and public health professionals, when I come out of retirement to this session in 20 years, I will hear that you have gotten us to the 2020 goals and beyond. So thank you. So I think we have time for a few questions, do we?
So yeah, we're going to take a couple of questions here from the audience. It's warming up here. Hello. So we'll pass this mic around and give one to Lorene, and we're going to switch out some of our sound pieces here so we have a little bit better sound quality, and then we'll move on. So go ahead, Lorene, this is for you.
So I wasn't talking loud enough the whole time?
No,
sorry.
It's our mic.
Oh.
So I've read the guidelines, but it was after the recent conference. Did you want me to stand up?
Sure.
Okay. I am Suzanne from, and I was wondering, did you address early introduction of solids for children that are at risk for
Peanut allergies?
or any allergies?
Yes. So I didn't have time to talk about that. She's referring to, probably most of you know, that the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with some recommendations about children that are at risk for allergies, and that actually the thing that we used to recommend is that you avoid peanuts or nuts or highly allergenic foods for infants, and they have found in trials that actually early introduction may help with some of the allergy symptoms and reduce allergies for infants that are at risk. So yes, there's a whole section on that in the report. But I didn't have time to cover it in the slides today.
Thank you. So in these recommendations, you included, for instance, sleep and physical activity and screen time. And you mentioned that in developing these, one of the thought process was making recommendations for the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans. So my question is, do you feel that it's important in the DGAs to also include recommendations for sleep and physical activity?
That's an excellent question. So did everybody hear it? No. Because it sounds like that mic isn't really working. So the question was that the dietary guidelines are about diet, but in our responsive feeding guidelines, we included recommendations on sleep and soothing and food safety and a whole bunch of physical activity and a whole bunch of other topics. So I, like you, probably read the USDA guidance on their recent comments, and they said it has to be about food. So in our NPI comments, we said, well, yes, it has to be about food, but for very young children that are learning to eat, the how is as important as the what. So we didn't tell them to go and focus on sleep or physical activity. We stopped at that point. And actually, I have no idea what what will end up in the 2025 dietary guidelines, 2020 to 2025. But I'm hoping that they at least include recommendations on the how. Because without those recommendations, I think it's going to be very non-useful for 0 to 24-month-olds. Yeah, excellent question.
Do you have guidelines for vegetarian families?
We do. So in our report, and I didn't talk about that either, but in our report, there are some recommendations for families that are vegetarian.
Is this working? Okay. Thank you for this excellent report. And I just wanted to share, and I'm from Oregon, I'm a state public health nutritionist, and we have used this report in our nutrition team in WIC, have dissected it, taken concepts that are relevant for our program, and incorporated it into our new staff training and
great.
some other. So we've taken this policy and then applied it to how we're going to use it in our program. So
I
just
will-
wanted to give kudos to the report.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to let Mary Story know, because the hope was, of course, that it'll be useful for the dietary guidelines, but for a lot of other things too. Any other questions? All right. Oh, one more.
Thanks, Lorraine. That was great. I'm sorry I walked in a little bit late. This whole responsive parenting framework, I think it's really exciting. You know, information is not usually new. It's just how we frame it and package it and kind of, get it to the right audience. So I guess this is kind of builds on the earlier question. Where do you think things stand? And maybe this is a question for Angie. Is like with USDA in terms of trying to, food is, in order to change a lot of food-related behaviors that we showed in one of the last slides, system, we kind of need to be really cutting across the system.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you feel things are today compared to maybe 10 years ago? And I'm sorry, that's a really hard question.
Yeah, it is a really hard question. Okay, so I'll repeat the question, and May, you shout out if I forgot anything. So, in recognition that food intersects with a whole bunch of other things, like we've talked about for the young children, but that's true for all of us, right? And how can we, as nutrition folks and maternal and child health, public health professionals, break down some of those silos so that we're integrating across all different systems and not just staying within the realm of food? I don't think that the dietary guidelines, and Angie, I'll let you comment, but I think they're going to stick on food as closely as possible. But I think it's up to us to keep pushing them to think about the whole food system and even beyond the food system, and how choices that we make about what we eat can impact people's economic livelihood, can impact all kinds of other systems besides even the food system. And so I'm hopeful that as the Dietary Guidelines Committee of 2015 took on sustainability, for example, that we can see more and more of those topics become discussed on a national level, so that we can eventually have an integrated system as opposed to the siloed parts of the system.
Well, and I'd like to make one comment, because we have at least 2 MCHB training programs in here. And part of what we do, of course, is interdisciplinary training with all the health professions, at least to start. And I think, for at least those of us here who are part of these training programs, but maybe we need to go out and talk to our other training programs. We do work very much interdisciplinarily, and we talk quite a bit about responsive feeding and how we train our dietitians, especially public health nutritionists. So I think there's maybe a call to action for many of us to maybe step up what we do and make it more widespread.
And I will say that kudos to RWJ, Mary Story at the Healthy Eating Research. In that panel, I didn't spend time going through all the members, but there were dietitians, there were nutritionists, there were pediatricians, there was a dentist, there was somebody who was more involved in food systems. So they did also try to, even in our guidelines, pull folks together who were coming at it from slightly different perspectives, which I thought was helpful. It made for the consensus process to sometimes take longer than it would have if it was all a group of dietitians, but I think the product was richer.
So now we have Angie Tagtow, who will take us forward with the dietary guidelines.
Now I have a lavalier. How does that sound for, is that okay up there? Okay, great. But you know, you just gave me the luxury of roaming the front, so that may make it more difficult to videotape. Good evening, everyone. Thanks to Dr. Herman for the gracious invitation to actually return to UCLA. I was here a couple of years ago and had the wonderful opportunity to speak here in this room. You're not hearing me very well? Okay, how's that? Is that any better? Would the handheld one be? I think it might be. Okay, we'll do that. Thanks for your patience, everyone. How's this? Is that better? A little bit? Okay. Is that better? Okay. I will try to speak as loud as I can. Thanks again for the wonderful invitation to join you this evening. I have the distinct pleasure of talking about the dietary guidelines for Americans, and I'm going to preface all of my remarks this evening by stating that I am the former executive director for the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion at USDA. As a political appointment, by law, I had to step out of that position in January of 2017. So my remarks tonight are not on behalf of USDA. They're simply my reflections on my experience during my time there and during the development and launch of the 2015-2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So this evening, I want to take you through a little bit of a journey with looking at the health status of Americans, specifically consumption and diet quality issues, a little bit of background on the dietary guidelines development process, looking at the process in the past, changes to date, and then the last piece I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we can all take action together. And I think Dr. Ritchie gave us a great example of the importance of research and how new research added to this development process is absolutely quintessential to assuring that we have the most current science guiding federal nutrition guidance systems. So first of all, where are we at when it comes to, stay in the light. So I can't roam, Dina? Okay. That's going to be really hard for me to do. We all need to be really grounded in what the data says, because I think it's really important to be able to defend why we have federal nutrition guidance in this country. And so, excuse me? So I think we really need to be looking at and being really well equipped with our 30-second elevator speech on the data used to justify nutrition guidance in this country. Some of these slides are going to look very familiar to you. This is consumption patterns here in the United States based on NHANES data of populations 1 year and older. And what the blue bars indicate is that we are falling short of meeting the dietary guideline recommendations in this country. So anywhere you see blue is we're falling short. We're either not meeting that guideline based on not eating enough. So for example, fruit and vegetables, we know that we're not eating enough fruits and vegetables in this country, down to the added components of added sugar, saturated fat, and sodium, we eat too much. And so our goal really is to get those consumption patterns more closer to that center line. That center line that runs through the middle of that visual is what the dietary guidelines recommend. We know that 3/4 of the population has an eating pattern that is not only low in fruits and vegetables, but also in fat and dairy as well. Another really great visual, again, these come from the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines, is overall dietary quality in this country. And this is a measurement of average diet quality in this country on a scale of 0 to 100, taking into consideration not only nutrients but food components as well. And as you can see, based on the most recent data, we have an average diet quality score in this country of 59. So think of it in terms of scoring a 59 on a test of 100 points. So we're failing as a country in eating healthfully. And I think that's probably an understatement after I said it. But we also need to look at morbidity and mortality rates in this country as well. And so I pulled together mortality rates comparing 1980 through 2015. And first you'll notice that there's been an increase in all causes of death in this country. That's the first thing that you should notice. But the second thing that you should notice is that a majority of the causes of death in this country can be attributed back to poor dietary habits. Okay? So poor dietary habits are contributing to a majority of the deaths in this country. Now, let's extrapolate that a little bit more. What does that really mean? Well, here in this country, it means that we're spending an awful lot on health care. Our health care expenditures have increased 530% since 1980. That's the GDP, I'm sorry. The national health expenditures, look at this, has increased over 1,100% since 1980. So currently, the national health expenditures as percent of GDP is almost 18%. And actually, it's probably over 18% if we use the most current data. But look at prescription drug expenditures. They have increased well over 2,600% since 1980. So knowing that a majority of the causes of death in this country are attributed to poor dietary patterns, in addition to seeing extremely high expenditures on health care, we know that nutrition becomes the most powerful tool in our toolbox to combat chronic disease and the skyrocketing healthcare costs in this country. Now, this is my opinion. We really need a serious and sustainable investment in nutrition education, in nutrition policy, as well as food systems that support healthy eating. And we're seeing the ills of this today. Our failure to do so is leading to greater health disparities. It's weakening our domestic nutrition security, and it's a drain on our global economy. Okay? So we need to know why we need national nutrition guidance in this country. So a little bit about the dietary guidelines. And Lorene had already put up a really nice graphic demonstrating the history of dietary guidance in this country. But I wanted to highlight a couple of other major differences that have happened over the last almost 4 decades of the dietary guidelines. The first few brochures here were exactly that. They were brochures. They were developed by a group of nutrition experts using informed consensus, and the audience for those first few brochures were consumers themselves. They were written for consumer audiences. As we run through the last 5 to 10 years worth of dietary guidance, the audience has changed. Today, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is written for a professional audience. And this is a message that I hope you will carry to your colleagues. I think that one of the biggest misnomers about the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the actual document, is for consumers. It's not. It's written for professionals. Okay, so that's one message I want to make very clear with you today. The other thing is that the first few brochures that were written for consumers that outlined the dietary guidelines for consumers were built on informed consensus of nutrition experts. We have significantly increased the systematic review methodology that is used in developing the dietary guidelines for Americans. And so over the years, the review of the most current bodies of literature is much more robust than it ever has been. And I'll talk about that systematic review process in a little bit. These first couple of editions were more heavily focused on nutrients. And then we saw an evolution to food and food groups. And now we're into food patterns. So that's another evolution over the course of the last four decades. The other thing I wanted to emphasize with this particular graphic is that the most current dietary guidelines reflects the most current bodies of science. And so when we talk about the original charge that was given to USDA and HHS by Congress in 1990, it first charged the departments to revise the dietary guidelines every 5 years. So two important pieces of information on that. Two federal agencies needed to work together to develop national nutrition guidance, and they needed to update it with the most current science every 5 years. So federal governments working together, two departments working together, it just multiplies the amount of vetting and the number of people involved in that process. But the next two bullets here really is the scope. And reflecting back on the ending of Lorraine's remarks and what the scope is to include in the dietary guidelines became a rather sticking point in the development of the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines. First of all, shall contain nutritional and dietary information and guidelines for the general public, shall be based on the preponderance of the scientific and medical knowledge which is current at the time the report is prepared. So those two bullets really outline the scope of the dietary guidelines. And then the last is use. It shall be promoted by each federal agency in carrying out any federal food, nutrition, or health program. So I think we automatically assume that in dietary guidelines, they apply to everyone. To prevent the onset of diet-related chronic disease, and specifically for populations ages 2 and older. But they're originally intended to be applied across all federal food and nutrition programs. But the one element that I want you to remember about this is that when this was passed in 1990, it was unfunded. So Congress did not appropriate any funds to USDA or HHS to support this charge, okay? And even to date, there has not been any congressional appropriation for the dietary guidelines and to support the work of developing and revising the dietary guidelines every 5 years. There's a but. In the federal fiscal year 2016 budget appropriations, Congress decided to add a rider into those appropriations that charged USDA in particular to work with the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine to do a comprehensive study on the process of developing dietary guidelines. I'll get into the issues as to why in a little bit. But that's the only time Congress has ever put any money forward to the dietary guidelines. See, they didn't like what they were hearing about the process of developing the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines. And so they charged USDA to conduct a study to look at the process of developing the dietary guidelines. That $1 million appropriation was the only time Congress has supported that. Now, for those of you who are nutritionists and dietitians in the audience, how many of you assumed, like I did, that the federal government is paying for this? Congress supports it, they fund it. How many of you thought that? So since 1990, both USDA and HHS appropriately budget to support the process every 5 years. So let's talk about the process next. So the first, it really does take 5 years, and I would actually contend it takes more than 5 years to revise the dietary guidelines. There's first a great deal of administrative work on the front end. There's a lot of project management. There is working with the Federal Advisory Committee Office for the federal government in getting just the whole project plan set in place and get the teams from both USDA and HHS together and on the same plan. And this is reflective of 2015-2020 dietary guidelines. So the next step is to solicit nominations for a scientific advisory committee, an external group of experts who can look at the most current bodies of science and provide their recommendations back to both agencies. And that work usually takes about 18 to 24 months. Dr. Ritchie had mentioned Dr. Mary Story and Dr. Rafael Escamilla Perez, and both of them served on the 2015-2020 Dietary Guidelines for American. They were our external experts who deliberated over the science. Once their work is done, they then provide a report of their recommendations to USDA and HHS. And so the secretaries of both departments then accept that report. The next phase is that report goes out for public comment. And in 2015, that report was out for public comment. I believe it was 75 days. Congress asked us to increase the number of days that it was open for public comment. The agencies receive public comment. They have the recommendations from the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, and then they go to work to draft the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And if I were to guess the number of people that were involved across both USDA and HHS, it's somewhere in the range of 150 to 170 individuals. And these are mostly career staff. They're scientists. They are experts in nutrition guidance who work together in developing that next product. And then we release them. But I added another step to this process because remember I said that the audience for the dietary guidelines today is professionals. So we needed to take it an extra step and translate those guidelines into consumer messages and products and resources. And that's where MyPlate comes into play. MyPlate was released in 2010 after the 2010 dietary guidelines, and we continued with the MyPlate version after the 2015, but it was the MyPlate My Wins campaign that reflected the messages from the 2015 guidelines. Now, we hear a lot about public comment. Public comment is an extremely important element of the dietary guidelines development process. And in the 2015 process, during the deliberation of the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, as well as once their report was out for public comment, that was the entire public comment period. So, folks had the opportunity to provide comment for, 2.5 years on this, okay? So that was the 2015 process. And like I said, the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion takes it one step further, and we make sure that there are appropriate consumer-based materials that are ready to go that complement the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. I give the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion staff a heck of a lot of credit. The amount of scrutiny and pressure that we were all under in developing the 2015 Dietary Guidelines, we were also able to deliver at the same time of the launch MyPlate, My Wins campaign materials. So health professionals not only got the guidance in January of 2016, but they also got the consumer materials as well. The reason I highlight that is historically, those consumer-based materials, as many of you know, didn't come out for 12 or maybe 16, 18 months after the launch of the dietary guidelines. And so we really put forth our best foot forward to make sure that professionals were well equipped. Now, I'm going to go through these very quickly because you all should know these inside and out, top, bottom, backwards and forwards. Here are the guidelines themselves. I want to highlight one thing here. Guideline number 1 is to follow a healthy eating pattern across the lifespan. there's two very important elements in that first guideline. The first is the identification of a healthy eating pattern. Okay, so remember we went from nutrients to food, food groups, and now we're into patterns. And we introduced the lifespan concept. So we knew that dietary guidelines needed to continue to evolve in that direction. And I'm not going to spend any time on these. These are the actual patterns themselves as far as the food groups and the recommendations for food groups. And here are the quantitative limits that were included in the 2015 guidelines. And of course, emphasizing physical activity. And for those of you who are following the physical activity guidelines that HHS is currently revising, I believe they should be coming out sometime in 2018, sometime this year. Now, there's a really great handout available that CNPP developed towards the end of 2017. Remember I said we needed to make sure that we were grounded in the data, that we had a really good grasp of the data so that we could defend the need for nutrition guidance in this country. CNPP has a wonderful infographic that captures these tidbits of information. And so I encourage you to go to the Dietary Guidelines website and you will find a Dietary Guidelines infographic. And so it talks about the diet-related chronic disease rates in this country, the diet quality in this country. It also talks about the expenditures as well. I wanted to specifically highlight this piece. There's a very important element that I actually strongly encourage not only nutritionists and dietitians to hone up on, but also public health practitioners as well. We need to make sure that we carry an economic argument in our back pocket. So we already know what the healthcare expenditures are in this country, and we have great studies that look at specific diet-related chronic diseases, whether it's cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or hypertension, and their related healthcare expenditures. But we also need to be working with economists and further strengthening our economic argument about the need for healthy eating in this country. And again, I applaud USDA for doing this. They have this piece in that infographic. If we invest $10 per person each year toward improving nutrition, increasing physical activity, and preventing tobacco use, that could save the United States $16 billion annually within 5 years. To me, that is pretty dramatic. And now we're starting to get the data to support these estimates. So again, another very important point I want to make tonight is we need to be strengthening our economic argument for this, for healthy eating in this country. And here are just a couple of pieces that I have pulled together that I continue to use. They are from the Union of Concerned Scientists as well as for Trust for America's Health. And I think the whole fruit and vegetable consumption equation is very fascinating. And they worked very closely with a group of economists to highlight those potential economic benefits. So back to the National Nutrition Monitoring Related Research Act of 1990, the dietary guidelines for Americans are to be applied to federal food and nutrition programs. Okay, that is what the charge is. And this is just a sampling of some of the federal agencies and some of the programs that currently use the dietary guidelines in some form or fashion. In food and nutrition services, we know that the dietary guidelines are used as that policy framework to set whether it's the WIC food package with the IOM recommendations or whether it's actually identifying appropriate foods that fit into a healthy meal pattern. They may also be used for nutrition education. We have a lot of My Plate materials that are available for the food and nutrition programs, the 15 programs within SNS. We have ARS and ERS who use the dietary guidelines in a variety of research capacities. AMS uses the dietary guidelines for their commodity marketing boards. And then those non-USDA agencies, of course, HHS uses the dietary guidelines in a variety of fashions across a variety of agencies within that department. Veterans Affairs uses the dietary guidelines not only in their meal planning, but they also use MyPlate in their nutrition education programs, both inpatient and outpatient. Department of Defense uses the dietary guidelines extensively, not only in procurement standards, but also with their meal planning as well. So just to give you some examples, again, it's not just within food and nutrition services. The dietary guidelines do get used with many departments across the federal family. And it's my estimate that the application of the guidelines across the federal family has the potential of reaching about 1/3 of the U.S. population every day. Think of the school lunch program, for example. Think of the WIC program. So another message I want to make very clear about the dietary guidelines: the dietary guidelines are not regulation. They do not go through a formal rulemaking process. They are simply guidance, just like the physical activity guidance. Okay? But the dietary guidelines, think of it as the foundation for a house. And that foundation for that house needs to be really strong in order to support that framework for nutrition programs, practices, and often referred to as the Farm Bill. There was a clause in there that mandated that the dietary guidelines be expanded to include dietary guidance for infants and toddlers, so birth to up to 24 months of age, as well as women who are pregnant and beginning with the 2020-2025 edition. The Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion and the sister agency, the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion at HHS, actually started working on creating the framework for this brand new nutrition guidance for these populations back in 2012. And it was in 2014 that Congress passed this charge onto HHS and USDA to include this new nutrition guidance in the 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans. But you can guess where I'm going for next. Do you think this was funded or unfunded? Again, it was an unfunded approach that Congress took. And the reason I put the evolution of dietary guidance on that one screen is to also demonstrate that the development or the revision of the dietary guidelines is very much an iterative process. It builds upon what had happened 5 years prior. So it's not developing new guidance every time. It's building upon the past guidance. Whereas this charge for birth to 24 and pregnant women nutrition guidance is brand new. It's building it from the ground up. And with the systematic review methodology that's in place, it creates a very extensive, robust process, but also a very expensive one. The other thing that has happened, I mentioned, in the FY16 appropriations, Congress tacked in a rider charging USDA to work closely with the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to study the process of developing the dietary guidelines. They released their first report in February of 2017, and that's really looking at the process for establishing the dietary guidelines, really looking at the nomination and selection process for the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. The second consensus report was released in September of 2017, so just this last fall, and that almost 300-page document lists a lot of different recommendations back to USDA and HHS for strengthening the process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides because I know they're going to be hard to read. I just encourage you to seek out those two consensus reports to learn more about the recommendations, especially if you're going to take action on the dietary guidelines. I think it's very important to know what the recommendations are. From the first report, they recommended a third party to review the nominations of qualified candidates. They also recommended a provisional committee that would then go out for comment before final selection. And then, another public comment period for that provisional committee. These are recommendations by the National Academies. I don't know if USDA and HHS are going to employ them or not. But my response to this, yes, these are best practices, but it's going to increase the amount of time the agencies require to get through these processes. So to highlight some of the other recommendations that came out, the first set of recommendations were really around adding additional groups to the process, and those groups are a combination of both internal and external experts. The other recommendation towards the bottom there is to provide the public with a clear explanation when the agencies decide to omit or accept only parts of the conclusion of the scientific report. That became definitely an issue in the 2015 dietary guidelines. But the visual on the right side is a remapping of the process from this external group that the National Academies put together. Other recommendations include very specific recommendations on increasing the robustness and the scientific rigor of the Nutrition Evidence Library. This is the systematic review methodology that was developed in 2008-2009, was employed in the 2010 dietary guidelines, and during my time at CNPP, we employed quality control characteristics to the process to make sure that we were using the best of the best practices across the systematic review methodologies, whether it was Cochrane Collaborative, whether it was ARC, or the Evidence Analysis Library of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. The last few recommendations of the second report, again, strengthening the food pattern modeling processes, which is a very appropriate recommendation, standardizing the methods and criteria for establishing nutrients of concern, again, a very valid recommendation. But this is the one that I wanted to highlight in regards to May's question to Lorene. They had identified a recommendation that include research evaluation strategies to develop and implement systems approaches to the dietary guidelines for Americans. The selected strategies should then begin to be used to integrate systems mapping and modeling into the DGA process. So the recommendation from the National Academies is to definitely take what started as a socio-ecological model in 2010 and continue to expand it into a systems framework and the role of the dietary guidelines in that framework. So, but again, these are recommendations from the National Academies. It is to be determined how USDA and HHS implement them. So to date, there's been some activity to date on the development of the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines. USDA is now in the administrative lead. HHS was the administrative lead for the 2015 dietary guidelines, and that flips back and forth every 5 years. USDA has held listening sessions this winter and through invitation brought stakeholders together to listen to their suggestions and concern. They just finished a 30-day public comment period on a list of topics and questions, a majority of which related to the birth to 24 and pregnant women population, again, to get public comment on the topics and questions before the solicitation for members of the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. That is a new step that has been added to date. Again, emphasizing the life stage approach, more so in this edition than in the 2015 edition. And according to the new administrator of Food and Nutrition Services, nomination of the 2020-2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee will be sometime in the spring or early summer. So those of you who are in academia, even those of you who are in graduate programs, I strongly encourage you to think about nominations for this committee. It is imperative that individuals coming to this committee are fully equipped with the appropriate knowledge in order, especially to develop new guidance for birth to 24 and pregnant women. Some other decisions have happened to date as well. And as you know, administrations changed in January of 2017. And one of the first decisions that was made by the new Secretary of USDA was, quote unquote, restoring local control of guidelines on whole grain, sodium, and milk for school nutrition. And so we're rolling things back a little bit in those areas. In September of 2017, after a public comment period, the Secretary initiated a new reorganization plan, and one of the elements in the reorganization plan was, I quote, instead of having a politically appointed administrator of the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion, the agency will be headed by a career associate administrator incorporating CNPP into the Food and Nutrition Services, which will improve administrative efficiencies and allow closer integration of the work of these two agencies. So right now, there is no administrator for the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. And I believe that there hasn't been too much progress made on identifying a career associate administrator. I think this poses another opportunity for individuals and institutions to provide input to FNS as to the qualifications that that administrator needs to have. So I put that message in your ear as well. Another change, those of you who are familiar with the online consumer nutrition resource Super Tracker will be sunset in the spring of this year. And as far as I know, there is not a substitute that has been identified. There is not any effort to update or keep Super Tracker maintained moving forward. So those of you who might be working with Cooperative Extension, or I know WIC has used Super Tracker, I know a lot of schools use Super Tracker. For those of your partners who maybe use Super Tracker, check to see if they have a replacement or backup for that. Now, before I talk about budget, I do want to say that the federal fiscal year 2018 omnibus appropriation that was just passed literally two weeks ago did not enforce all of the White House recommendations for the FY18 budget. So the White House recommendations for the federal fiscal year budget really decreased a significant investment in nutrition programs and nutrition education. But Congress, who ultimately makes that decision, I think held many of the programs harmless. And the FY18 budget, it could have been a little bit better, but it wasn't as bad as what the White House budget would have planned. But we also have a budget summary prepared for federal fiscal year 2019, and that budget proposal for 19 for USDA is available on their website. I would encourage you to all take a look at that. There are significant cuts in nutrition programming and nutrition education across USDA. Those of you who might receive funding through MCHB or other HHS resources, I encourage you to look at their budget summary as well, because I anticipate that those budgets have significant cuts to many of the programs that we are connected to. But, so my hammering about the dietary guidelines being unfunded for the last 4 decades, I had a glimmer of hope. In the FY19 budget summary for USDA, there is a tiny clause buried in the Food and Nutrition Service budget line item that includes $12 million to develop the 2020 dietary guidelines for which USDA is the lead agency. Starting with the 2020 dietary guidelines, the scope will be expanded to include guidance for pregnant women, toddlers, and infants. So any of you who are preparing remarks to either USDA or Congress related to nutrition, nutrition programs, nutrition policy, or the dietary guidelines, make sure that you emphasize that this is a much needed part of the funding in order to realize the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines. So remarkable that it got in there, very remarkable that it got in there, but now it needs the support. CNP and the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion have a tremendous charge to be able to fulfill the Agricultural Act of 2014 with the addition of nutrition guidance for those populations. This is what's going to help them get there. And especially with these new recommendations that came out of the national academies, they do require additional funding in order to see them implemented. So I know somebody's going to ask me the question, will the 2020 process change? Will it be different? And I copied and pasted this right off the Q&A piece of the Dietary Guidelines website. So just to simply highlight, we plan to add some new steps in response to the National Academy's recommendations, but overall, the fundamental pieces of the process should stay the same, is what they're saying. So where do we go from here? So the very first thing that I strongly recommend, that if you haven't already visited dietaryguidelines.gov, is to go to the new website and scroll to the bottom and sign up for the updates. This will make sure that you're current on all of the maybe new steps that are happening, the timeline, everything. I have a list of other opportunities that are very appropriate, I think, for this audience. So in addition for signing up for updates, also sign up for alerts on the Federal Register, because the Federal Register is actually the official notice of any public comment opportunities. I also encourage you to sign up for updates from the Senate Ag, the Senate House, as well as the House Ag Appropriation Committees. So we're in the process of hammering out a new farm bill, and Title IV is extremely important to make sure that there aren't drastic cuts to supplemental nutrition programs as well as nutrition education. And so getting those updates as to where specifically the House Ag Committee is with the development of the Farm Bill is extremely critical. Those of you who are tracking Child Nutrition Act, Child Nutrition Reauthorization of the Healthy Hunger for Kids Act, I think that is just simply on hold. And so if you can shift your energies over to the Farm Bill, specifically targeting Title IV, the nutrition title, that would be amazing. I already mentioned this earlier, but making sure that you submit strong nominations to the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. Again, getting those updates through dietaryguidelines.gov as well as the Federal Register notice will make sure that you're not missing any deadlines. Public comment. Now, this is just something that I anticipate because we've already seen this demonstrated in the last month with a new step of public comment added to this process. But anytime that you can submit public comment during this deliberation of the 2020 dietary guidelines is going to be beneficial. So all of the great research that Dr. Ritchie highlighted is going to be critical, not only for getting into the hands of the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, but also in preparation for the 2025 dietary guidelines, because this is ongoing research that's going to just continue to build a very rich body of literature. Attending any House Ag or House Ag appropriation hearings, whether it's for Food and Nutrition Services, and who knows, there might be a dietary guidelines hearing. Now, that was an unprecedented event in 2015. I actually had the wonderful opportunity of being able to testify in front of Congress 4 times in 13 months. And another unprecedented event was having the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Vilsack, as well as the HHS Secretary, Secretary Burwell, both appear in front of the House Ag Committee just to testify on the dietary guidelines. And so we saw a lot of unprecedented things in the development of the 2015 guidelines. Volunteer to provide testimony, whether it is by invitation. Lorene had done that in past years, had come to USDA and provided comment directly to us. But if there's ever opportunity to share your story with members of Congress and to testify at a hearing as to the value of the service, the value of providing nutrition and nutrition education, I encourage you to take advantage of that. Don't say no. There will be lots of people who can help you prep for that. Having an awareness of the platforms of other groups is going to be very important in moving forward with the 2020 dietary guidelines. Because there's going to be new nutrition guidance added to this edition, there are going to be new stakeholders and new interested parties that may dominate the conversations. And so once again, it's critical to not only understand their positioning, but also to be able to come forward with your position also. Have meetings with congressional staff. We've got folks from all over the western part of the state here today, and some very important members of Congress who serve on the committees that I had mentioned earlier. Very important to build relationships with those decision makers. With our messaging, I think we need to continue to remember that it's not only the health impact that is important to our message, but it's also the impact that nutrition has on social issues, as well as we know we've got an economic argument that is starting to build. And working with, whether it's statisticians, analysis, or economists to help strengthen that economic argument. Tell decision makers how you use the dietary guidelines, whether it's in your programs, your practices, your policies, and how you use MyPlate and the number of people that it reaches. Tell them about the work that you do. You have phenomenal stories, and especially those practitioners that you work with who are on the front lines in delivering services. Make sure that their stories are known. And lastly, to work with your professional organizations. I've had the opportunity to work actually very recently with several professional organizations to get them primed to jump in now with the 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans. So lastly, we can't take federal nutrition guidance and our core nutrition education resources for granted anymore. I think we all recognize that our political environment right now is fraught with unpredictability and volatility. And because of the controversies that ensued with the 2015 dietary guidelines for Americans, we can't assume that they're always going to be there. And so my ask of all of you tonight is make sure that you step up and you support these. So I am going to be one of the first ones to admit that walking into that job at USDA, I totally took these things for granted because they were always tools in my toolbox. They were always there. I could always count on the federal government with equipping me with the best tools that I could provide either in my programs, my policies, or my services. We can't take these things for granted anymore. So those of you who are dietitians, especially, and nutritionists, who dietary guidelines really is the backbone of our profession. It's the backbone of many of the programs that we have. I don't know of a world in which we don't have national nutrition guidance. I don't know what that world would be. So I'm here to tell you tonight that we all need to step up. We all need to support the process. We all need to assure that the individuals selected in the next dietary guideline advisory committee have the skill and the knowledge to be able to do what they're asked to do. We need to ensure that both USDA and HHS are held accountable to upholding the National Nutrition Monitoring Related Research Act. And we need to tell our stories to decision makers that the value of nutrition in this country and the value that federal nutrition guidance brings. Okay? So take a breather here. take a step back. And I wanted to give you another framework to think about this. Dietary guidelines is a sliver of a much bigger discussion. We already alluded to systems elements when it comes to nutrition. But nutrition really is part of our food system. And our food system has a very fascinating relationship, not only with health, which we know that, but it also has a fascinating relationship with our economy, with social health, and with our environmental health. And so one of the last thoughts I want to leave with you today is that the system that generates our food has significant impact on all four of these domains. And as nutrition and health professionals, we can defend these impacts on not only human health, but social health, economic health, and environmental health. But likewise, there's a reciprocity relationship here. These domains have profound influence on the quality, quantity, and healthfulness of the food system. So my point being is the dietary guidelines are part of a much bigger system that as public health professionals, we need to address, okay? So we can segment and silo the dietary guidelines to their issues, but we have to recognize that the work that we do has much bigger, profound influence on not only the food system, but multiple systems. So this is my last slide, Dina, promise. So like I said, I don't believe we can take federal nutrition guidance and nutrition education resources for granted. But I do believe we're at a time in which our collective action, whether it's through our stories, our services, publications, we emphasize the importance of research, they can create the most impactful evidence on the human health benefits of a healthy eating pattern. These contributions can profoundly impact our policies, our practices, and our programs. So with that, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Angie, I'd like you to look into your crystal ball and tell us what you think will become of the Farm Bill.
I'm not going to be able to give you an adequate response to that. I can tell you that Colin Peterson, who is the minority on the House Ag Committee, is working very hard with the majority to come up with a bipartisan, put an X on the floor here, a bipartisan bill. And of course, being from Iowa and having two members of the congressional delegates serve on the Senate Ag Committee, I know that they won't even look at a farm bill unless it is bipartisan from the House. I am concerned about Title IV. There's, I think it's pretty well known, there's a target on the back of SNAP. And House Speaker definitely wants to implement very strong welfare reforms. But at this point, and now I haven't looked at the news today, I don't think that the majority on the House Ag Committee has publicly shared their draft with the minority. I know Colin Peterson has seen it, but I don't think the Democrats on the House Ag Committee have seen a draft. I've also heard that the House or the Senate Ag Committee is simultaneously working on a draft, but of course, that hasn't been shared publicly either. Now is the time to really rally folks to share their stories, especially if they get funding out of Title IV, whether it's SNAP, whether it's WIC. SNAP education is under attack, and some of these programs may shift back and forth between the Farm Bill and child nutrition reauthorization, for example. And so we need to be very attentive as to what's being talked about, what's being proposed, and who's at the table. For those of you who are members of a professional organization that do have an advocacy element to their organization, I strongly encourage you to ask where they are on the Farm Bill on the organization's advocacy platform. And if it's not there, to make sure that it is. But I can say that I would be very surprised to see one in the next 2 years. Things just are not moving. They are not moving. The other thing that I think is an urgent matter, because we've seen this in other areas of Congress right now, whether it's been the tax bill or what have you, is the very quick push to get things through without them being fully vetted. And we can't miss those opportunities. We can't miss those opportunities. So we need to rely on our advocacy groups. We need to make sure that we are connected into the notification system somehow. I think your guess is as good as mine. Oh, come on. No one's going to ask me what the controversy was in 2015, or you all know that story already? Yeah. You want to hear? Okay. Is it still on camera? Still being recorded? No, that's fine. That's fine. So actually, the question was asked to me on the ride to UCLA this afternoon, and that was the chicken or the egg. So did I come on board before or after the sustainability issue? So to back up, remember the process of developing the dietary guidelines, and we solicit input from an external body of experts to deliberate over the science. And one of the first tasks that they do is they identify topics and then research questions, and then they may actually develop subcommittees within the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. They map this out, and they go do their work. So in the development of the 2015 dietary guidelines, that committee was fully assembled in, I think, the first part of 2013. And so that's when they mapped all of their topics and issues, and then they went through the prioritization process and identified their research questions, and sustainability was added to the topics of interest at that time. I was invited to join the administration in July of 2014, and it was the same week in which the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee delivered their recommendations in a public forum of their sustainability recommendations. So I did not influence the process. It was totally a direction that the committee had identified in early 2013. So I wanted to make that fact known first. When they delivered their recommendations on the connection between our current consumption patterns and the use of natural resources, as well as the comparison of a healthy dietary pattern and the use of natural resources to support that pattern, they delivered those results in July of 2014. Remarkably, that wasn't a public event. We still had public comments open, so anybody could respond. Remarkably, there wasn't a large response at that point about the work of the committee. Well, of course, those recommendations were then in their final report, in which they delivered to both agencies technically in January of 2015. That report then went out for public comment, and Congress politely asked USDA and HHS to extend that comment because it was a pretty in-depth document. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report was 600 pages, and there was an additional 1,000 pages of supporting information that was on the website as well. So yes, a lot of information to sift through. But during that public comment period is what I would call a tsunami effect happened. No one was prepared for it because, like I said, the recommendations around sustainability had already been made known by the committee. So what appeared in the report wasn't really anything new. There wasn't really anything that had been altered between July and January. But if I may be so blunt, hell broke loose at that time. And what happened were there were a lot of stakeholders within Washington, D.C. who did not appreciate sustainability as part of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans process and did not feel it was appropriate that the dietary guidelines include issues around natural resource impact and use when it comes to current consumption patterns and healthy dietary patterns. And so these stakeholders, many of them very powerful entities, went to Congress and shared their concerns with Congress. Congress then turned around, and throughout 2015, they put a lot of pressure on both USDA and HHS to omit sustainability from the next edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And so throughout 2015, it was a rather tumultuous time because of this particular topic. Now, with that said, the several iterations prior to the 2015 guidelines did receive some attention, and many individuals in the food and beverage industries, of course, provided strong comments on recommendations for past editions. So that engagement wasn't necessarily unusual. It was the volume of engagement that became problematic. And so USDA and HHS had received almost 30,000 comments on the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. Now, this is in comparison to 2,000 comments that were received on the 2010 Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. Okay, so like I said, stakeholders went to Congress. Congress then came to USDA and HHS and said, we don't support this added element in the dietary guidelines at all. And they essentially said, listen, it's appropriation season. You know, if you move forward with this, we might take something away from you. And there were actually rumors during that time of eliminating or not allowing USDA and HHS to even move forward delivering 2015-2020 dietary guidelines. There were also rumors of eliminating the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. There was a proposal to eliminate the executive director's position at that time as well. And so then it became a discussion of risk management. So if the agencies felt strongly enough, and we did not get the direction of the White House to move that to include sustainability in the 2015 guidelines either. So that's another piece of information that's important. And so it was appropriation season, and both Secretary Vilsack and Secretary Burwell wanted to, of course, protect the rest of the programs within their federal departments and obliged by Congress's demands. And sustainability did not move forward in the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines. So a question that I often get asked, well, should we push for it for 2020? My position on that today is we already know that there's a big charge in front of USDA and HHS for 2020, and that's to build new nutrition guidance for birth to 24 and pregnant women populations. That's a huge charge in itself. Pushing forward sustainability, first and foremost, it has to be identified by the next Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee to warrant additional investigation and systematic review processes. So it would need to be identified by that next committee first. And I think we're just a little too fresh from all of the activities in 2015 that Congress is not going to forget that. Both secretaries came forward in October of 2015 and said, you know, we looked at the 1990 National Nutrition Monitoring Related Research Act, and we don't believe that the authors would have put sustainability within the scope or the parameters of the dietary guidelines for Americans. So this is not only testimony that they provided to Congress, it's also in writing in both departments. And I just think it's a little too fresh for folks to have forgotten that. I also wouldn't want a topic like that to derail the work that is needed to support high quality nutrition guidance for these new populations. It's essential that that happen. So I would encourage people to continue the work on, you know, independently with other institutions, continue to develop more robust bodies of evidence supporting the connection between our consumption patterns and what our natural resources can and cannot provide for us. Okay? I think that research is extremely important. When it comes to national nutrition security, it's very important. You all live in, most of you live in California. You're already seeing the impact of what weather patterns do to agriculture production in the state. We're starting to see it in the Midwest. The Ogallala Aquifer, which feeds a lot of grain fields within the Midwest, is depleted. What are those grain farmers going to do? What's going to happen to the grain supply down the road? There's a lot of things that are happening in political conversations that we need to be asking, what is the impact on our food system and what is the impact on the quality and quantity of healthy foods in this country? So when we talk about trade and tariffs, whether it's on aluminum or steel, or whether it's on hogs or soybeans, it's all going to affect that bigger food system. Here's a classic example of one of the reasons why the 2015 Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee felt so strongly at looking at sustainability when it comes to dietary guidelines was, for those of you who remember, in the 2010 dietary guidelines was a new recommendation on fish and seafood, right? 8 ounces a week. Well, what USDA and HHS didn't anticipate was immediately after that, the response that came from NOAA and other fish and seafood entities across the globe, that currently U.S., or at that time, U.S. fish stocks were so depleted, even if every person in the United States ate 8 ounces of fish or seafood a week, the global fish stocks wouldn't be able to support that. So I think that's a responsibility that USDA and HHS needs to address, is the responsibility of putting out dietary guidelines in which the Earth's resources can support. That's my personal opinion. So that's the background on sustainability.
Hi there. I have a question related to the slide you had up about health expenditures. And which I think is a great slide. A lot of public funds are going towards, public payers are paying out for nutrition-related conditions. So for example, I think Medicare Advantage is paying out for physical activity. I think they just passed something to use those funds for groceries as well. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on how funds would be appropriated towards more funds for either pushing more research in dietary guidelines or funds for programs such as National Diabetes Prevention Program, which is weight related, and so much of that is focused on, you know, the nutrition component, the physical activity component. What are your thoughts in terms of looking at the economic component of that in using dietary guidelines or advancing appropriate funds for that to continue that guidance to come out, and then also allowing that to inform several programs for nutrition guidance. Sorry, was that a loaded question?
Well, I think when we're advocating for anything, especially when it's developed at the federal level and it's applied at a state level, and the state level still has opportunity for, the local control element of it. Again, I always come back to making sure that we are demonstrating our value of our services, first of all. And some of you have heard me say this in the past. As nutritionists, as dietitians, we need to be much more assertive and aggressive in that area. We need to let people know, especially decision makers, the value that we bring through the program and services. I think you need to break things down a little bit and tackle economic arguments at a smaller level, and then they get bigger. And so when we start to tease out the healthcare expenditures, for example, on the different chronic diseases, we have that information. And the use of visuals is another really great way of being able to tell the story and demonstrate impact. We have to move beyond just the bean counting. These are the number of people served. I don't think that matters to decision makers anymore. We need to be able to demonstrate how this is going to save money. We need to be able to demonstrate how it's going to impact economic elements at a state, community, and at a household level. And that requires partnerships with people that we may not have a relationship with. I had a wonderful opportunity to work with economists at USDA. Now, mind you, they speak a very different language than what nutritionists, dietitian, public health practitioners use. It's worth building those relationships. So I would outline what the key arguments are, regardless of the issues. Outline what you want to accomplish. Bring together the people who can help develop the strongest arguments possible, and then be able to deliver it in not necessarily an academic format, but that's why I brought that infographic in that demonstrates the value of the dietary guidelines. We need to be able to convey these messages in bite-sized formats and easily digestible ways, and visuals help with that. So I recommend those types of things regardless of what the issues are. If it's getting more money, that's a big challenge. Building relationships is key. Oftentimes when we have interactions with decision makers, it's when we want something, right? Oftentimes we're prompted to go visit with somebody because we need something, we want something, we need to tell them something. But I think we need to re-examine those relationships and start building them up over time. So I use the case of city council members or the mayor or even elected school board officials having a date for coffee just to get to know them and talk about the work that you do without an ask. Get together with them again in a few months down the road and say, I have some interesting information about some constituents in your area that I think you'd really want to know. Of course, HIPAA aside, but within the parameters of what we can share, and start building those relationships up. The only way that we're going to be able to get things done and make a difference is being able to demonstrate our value of our programs and services, to be able to add the economic argument into our discussions. It's one thing to talk about chronic disease rates and morbidity and mortality and even consumption patterns and things like that, and you're just going to get here in the headline. You're going to get glazed over eyes. But if you can tell them this is how it's going to impact the constituents in your area, they're going to be listening. And so practice with your colleagues on that pitch. It never hurts to attend advocacy days, whether it's at your state capitol or in Washington, D.C., and follow others who've gone through the process. We need to get through this hurdle of talking about policy and empowering ourselves that we can influence policy. We can. We can. So that was a long way around, but there's a lot of tips and tools in there that I think, regardless of what we want to achieve, we need to carve out what that plan is.
Hi. To go back to the issue of sustainability, it seems like always a very sort of long-term framing around that issue, when there is evidence to show currently that climate change is reducing the nutrient content of fruits and vegetables. And I'm curious why that's not brought up more as part of this conversation, and if the dietary guidelines is not the appropriate place to have these conversations now, given the greater political context. Where should we be trying to bring this up more?
There are lots of opportunities. Well, first of all, continuing to encourage researchers and scientists to publish their results of their science, of their research. We need to continue to build the evidence, first and foremost. You know, the interesting thing about how air temperatures rise, I believe its protein contents in a lot of vegetables decreases and carbohydrates increase. Did I get that right? Does that sound right? So we're actually changing the nutrient composition of a lot of our foods. And so one of the things we should be doing is making sure that Agriculture Research Service at USDA is fully funded, and to make sure that they're looking into this. I mean, this could be significant. Lots of opportunities to be able to take that argument, connect it back to nutrients, food groups, and dietary patterns, because that's what the topics are, and be able to make a very strong argument. And so there are opportunities to be able to, you know, push those things forward. I do know that several professional organizations are continuing the discussions about dietary patterns and sustainability, and whether it's in the form of a resolution, whether it's in the form of a position statement for that organization, those things are happening. There are new groups that are coalescing around sustainability. It sounds lovely. Sustainability and dietary patterns. And so there are other efforts that we can direct some of our energy, and it's not going to go away. This is a topic that, in my professional opinion, should have been addressed beginning 10 years ago. And I actually applaud the 2015 DGAC for adding that as a topic to do further investigation and to be bold enough to put forward their recommendations. With that said, a very valuable body of evidence that is now available to us that wasn't available before is the systematic review that they did on these topics that are now in the public domain in the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee scientific report. And so we can use that as a stepping stone to many, many other things, and can always be used as a solid reference as well. And so I think it's our professional obligation, again, to bring the system perspective into this discussion. Dietary guidelines cannot be siloed. And I think we've already demonstrated that in the 2010 and the 2015 guidelines with the use of the socio-ecological model. Now, originally, that model was used to demonstrate the influences on dietary knowledge, attitude, and behavior. But we recognize that the socio-ecological model actually provides a great framework for interventions at a policy, system, and environmental level. And so we need to be cognizant of that. I mean, these topics cannot operate in isolation. There is the connectivity to the much broader systems discussion that I think we are obligated to maintain. That's not the perspective of USDA or HHS. That is my professional perspective. Question?
I was just curious, the nutrient database, do you know how often those foods are, if they are evaluated, or if we're actually looking at the nutrient content of foods from back in the, when was it, 50s, or you know what I mean?
That's a good question. I'd have to go to USDA's site to dig that up. I don't know if there is a periodicity schedule for updates on that. It's like the DRIs, right? DRIs are not updated on a regular basis. They should be, but not. I don't know about the nutrient database, what the periodicity of updating that is. I'm sorry, I don't.
I think a lot of nutritionists don't know is that there are a lot of holes in the data. There are a lot of estimates. So for acerola cherries, vitamin C, we have 81 data points in the USDA database, and we have a lot of zeros. There's a way you can get to look how many data points. So that question may not be that useful if we don't even have data points for a whole, for most values that are in the USDA database. I mean, like, for when I say most, I mean more than half are missing data points.
If I may, this brings up a really interesting challenge that I think we need to recognize. Okay, is the challenge of science. And this is becoming a little bit more of the norm. It definitely was a tactic, a strategy that was used in the development of the 2015 guidelines. We saw a lot of challenges around the science of sodium and hypertension. We saw a lot of challenges around sodium consumption and the impact on children. Even though I believe the evidence is pretty solid, we need to recognize that tactics and science is being used as a strategy. And that's why I started the presentation with the snippets of information to make sure that we knew that data well, that we could produce reference for that data in the event that we were challenged. But that is something that's happening now and could even ramp up, especially with the development of the 2020 dietary guidelines. So knowing the limitations of data is also something that is an excellent thing to know. And one of the exciting things about nutrition is that nutrition science is constantly evolving. And that's why it's important to update the dietary guidelines every 5 years to make sure that we are using the most current science. But I think it's also our responsibility to educate others that nutrition science is not static by any means. We have so much more to do, and that's what makes the field so exciting. Yeah, so thank you for letting me share that. Oh.
If you haven't figured it out already, I think we have a lot of work ahead of us on many, many fronts, including reaching across aisles from nutrition to a lot of our other professional friends outside of healthcare, making sense, thinking more economically, and of course, also getting active, meaning physically, but also from an advocacy perspective. So I want to thank our presenters for their amazing presentations, the audience, and a big shout out to my graduate trainees who really helped get this event off the ground and made it possible. So thanks all for a wonderful evening. And look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow at the NLN. Take care.